Welcome to This Explainer. I want you to think back, just for a moment, to those months immediately following the absolute darkest days of the pandemic. Remember the general mood? We were all promised this incredibly robust, smooth global economic recovery, weren't we? It was supposed to be a return to normal. We were told the absolute worst was in the rearview mirror and that the massive, complex machine of global commerce, after coming to a sudden, terrifying, and totally unprecedented halt, was finally sputtering back to life. And honestly, if things had gone according to plan, that really should have been the end of the story. We were supposed to experience a sharp, painful downturn, followed immediately by a triumphant, symmetrical rebound. You know, the classic textbook V-shaped recovery that economists just love to talk about. But as we're going to see today, here is what they definitely didn't tell you. So what actually happened to that perfectly smooth V-shaped recovery? Well, unfortunately, it was just an illusion. It wasn't the end of the story at all. In fact, it was merely the opening chapter in an entirely new kind of global chaos. Instead of a quick bounce back to perfectly normal, predictable times, we actually entered into this grueling 6-year saga. And this saga was defined not by a steady upward climb, but by a relentless, exhausting series of rolling, unpredictable shocks. Each one of these shocks completely rewrote the rules of the game in real time. By the time we actually reached 2026, the world was absolutely not popping champagne and celebrating a return to the before times. Instead, we woke up to a reality that felt fundamentally, permanently different. It was a world that was more fragile, profoundly more uncertain, and facing a fresh wave of strain that threatened to completely undo all the economic progress we had so painfully made.
So, to make sense of all this, here is our roadmap through the 4 distinct phases of chaos that fundamentally rewired the global economy. 1. The machine grinds to a halt. 2. The great inflationary whiplash. 3. The surprising soft landing. 4. 2026, featuring old shocks and new tech. And finally, Part 5, the core lessons from the economic chaos.
Okay, let's dive right into phase 1, the machine grinds to halt. This is the unprecedented coma of 2020.
To really understand the crash, we have to look at how things worked before it. For decades, leading right up to 2020, the global economy ran on this brilliant, finely tuned, almost miraculous system known as just-in-time manufacturing. The central idea here was incredibly simple, but highly, highly effective. Basically, instead of companies holding onto massive, expensive stockpiles of parts sitting around in giant warehouses collecting dust, components would show up at the factory doors literally just in time to be assembled. Imagine a microchip manufactured in Taiwan. It could be put on a giant cargo ship, arrive at a German car factory, and to be seamlessly slotted right into the dashboard of a brand new car in a matter of days. It was like a perfectly choreographed global ballet. It was a system built entirely around peak efficiency. It slashed storage costs, it massively boosted corporate profits, and ultimately, it gave consumers like you and me much cheaper goods. But, and this is a massive but, there was a catch. This beautiful, hyper-efficient system was absolutely perfect for a perfectly predictable world. It turned into a fatal vulnerability the very second everything stopped. Now, here's the absolute nightmare scenario that hit us in 2020. We experienced a simultaneous shock to both supply and demand. The pandemic forced governments around the world to deliberately shut down massive chunks of their own economies. Think about that for a second. This wasn't a normal recession where consumer demand just slowly fades away over a few quarters. No, on the demand side, people were literally trapped at home. They simply stopped spending money on services. Restaurants, airlines, hotels, they were completely hollowed out overnight. Nobody was taking vacations. But at the exact same time, the supply side was being aggressively dismantled. Remember that just-in-time system we just talked about? It shattered into a million pieces. Factories across China went totally dark. Bustling shipping ports transformed into eerie ghost towns. The complex, synchronized dance of ships, trucks, and planes that literally acted as the bloodstream of global trade just seized up. Imagine driving down the highway at 70 miles an hour and suddenly slamming on the emergency brake while simultaneously severing the fuel line. That is exactly what happened. The result was the sharpest, fastest global economic contraction in living memory. Just to put that in perspective, in the second quarter of 2020, the U.S. economy had its steepest drop on record. We're talking far worse than the 2008 financial crisis.
So governments and central banks stared down into this opening abyss, and they realized they were looking at a medically induced coma for the global economy. The patient was flatlining. It needed emergency life support, and it needed it immediately. So they launched monumental, historic interventions. Central banks slashed interest rates to zero to make borrowing as cheap as humanly possible, and they fired up the money printers with trillions. literally trillions, in quantitative easing to make sure banks kept lending. Meanwhile, governments unleashed a tidal wave of fiscal stimulus. Take the US, for example. They passed the $2 trillion CARES Act. It was the biggest relief package in American history. We're talking direct stimulus checks hitting people's mailboxes, beefed up unemployment benefits, and forgivable loans handed to businesses just to stop them from firing their workers. The goal here wasn't to create some sort of economic boom. It was literally just to build a massive financial bridge over a canyon of total bankruptcy. And you know what? It worked. It prevented a global depression. But as we are about to see, this massive, unprecedented cure would very soon cause a brand new disease.
Which brings us to phase 2, the great inflationary whiplash, the remarkably messy and chaotic rebound of 2021 and 2022. As the vaccines started rolling out in 2021, the great rebound finally began. But instead of a smooth, graceful return to normal, we got this messy, chaotic, inflationary whiplash. And the wild part is, it all started with our own behavior during the lockdowns. Think about it. We couldn't spend money on experiences. There were no concerts, no movies, no trips to Europe or Mexico. But we definitely didn't stop spending entirely. Armed with those government stimulus checks and sitting on built-up savings, we violently pivoted our habits. Since you couldn't take a vacation, you probably bought a Peloton. Instead of buying theater tickets, you bought a massive new TV, upgraded your laptop, and bought totally new furniture for your home office. We sent an absolute tsunami of unprecedented demand for physical goods crashing headfirst into a supply chain that was still in absolute tatters. Ports became wildly jammed, and the cost to ship a single container from Asia to the US exploded to 10 times its pre-pandemic price. The world's most efficient system suddenly became its biggest, most glaring bottleneck. Now let's track how this escalated. Early in 2021, central bankers kept going on TV and telling everyone, hey, don't panic. This inflation is just transitory. They fully assumed supply chains would quickly magically untangle and our shopping habits would normalize. But by late 2021, the bottlenecks stubbornly persisted, and inflation was clearly moving from the fringes and getting baked right into the core of the economy. And then, just when things were already incredibly tense, in February 2022, a massive geopolitical earthquake supercharged the chaos. Russia invaded Ukraine. Overnight, the entire global landscape transformed. Russia, which is a massive energy superpower, and Ukraine, which is basically one of the world's great breadbaskets exporting massive amounts of wheat, corn, and sunflower oil, were now engulfed in a brutal conflict. The resulting war and the subsequent global sanctions sent energy and food prices absolutely skyrocketing. This triggered a classic, brutal 1970s-style supply shock, and it was layered directly on top of an already dangerously overheating post-pandemic economy.
So that whole transitory narrative, it completely collapsed. It mutated into a full-blown five-alarm fire. In the United States, inflation hit a staggering 9%. 9%. That was a punishing 40-year high. And it wasn't just America. Over in the UK and across Europe, inflation actually soared well into the double digits. It was a harsh reality check. The era of easy money, of 0% interest rates, and endless government stimulus was officially irreversibly dead.
At this point, the world's central banks, who had been highly patient and were trying their absolute best to support the recovery, looked at those inflation numbers and realized they were way behind the curve. They were forced into a painful, dramatic U-turn. They had a single mission now: kill inflation, absolutely no matter what it took. So they launched the most aggressive series of interest rate hikes we had seen in decades. And the explicit goal here wasn't a secret. They literally wanted to deliberately slam the brakes on the economy. They needed to crush consumer demand, to make borrowing so expensive that we'd stop buying things, until demand finally fell back in line with those broken supply chains. The fear in the financial markets was palpable. The world was suddenly staring down the barrel of a completely new threat, the very real possibility that this incredibly harsh medicine for inflation would trigger a deep, severely painful global recession. And that incredibly tense moment brings us to phase 3, the surprising soft landing, defying gravity from 2023 to 2025. So the heavily predicted global crash just never arrived. How on earth did we pull off this magic trick? Let's break down the mechanics of why we didn't crash. First, by 2023, those nightmarish supply chains finally began healing. The ships got unloaded, the parts started flowing, and shipping costs plummeted back to reality. Second, we saw what economists call the Great Rotation. People finally stopped buying so many physical goods because, let's face it, how many laptops do you really need? And enthusiastically went back to spending on services. We started traveling, eating out, and going to concerts again. This took immense critical pressure off the factories. But the real superhero here, the absolute MVP of the soft landing, was the labor market. Employers engaged in a phenomenon called labor hoarding. Because it had been so incredibly difficult to find and hire workers back in 2021, bosses were absolutely terrified to let their staff go, even as interest rates soared and borrowing got expensive. They held on to their employees for dear life. And because everyday people kept their jobs and still had a little bit of a buffer left over from their pandemic savings, they just kept spending. So inflation steadily fell, but it happened without triggering the massive, catastrophic job losses everyone feared. A true soft landing. However, we have to be clear here. This soft landing was absolutely not a synchronized global success story. While the U.S. economy displayed incredible, almost stubborn resilience with a strong labor market and robust spending, the rest of the world painted a much darker picture. Europe spent this entire period essentially teetering on the edge of a recession, heavily battered by the massive energy crisis stemming from the war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, China's highly anticipated grand reopening post-COVID basically fizzled out. They got deeply bogged down by a massive crisis in the real estate market and consumers who were too nervous to spend. So what's really interesting here is that the era of synchronized global growth, where everyone rises and falls together, died right here. It exposed a deeply fragmented, multi-speed world where your economic reality depended entirely on where you lived.
Which rockets us forward to Phase 4, 2026, old shocks, new tech. The renewed strain and the age of uncertainty.
So here we are in 2026, and the fragile stability we fought so hard for is getting yanked into completely different opposing directions. It's like a massive global tug of war. On one side, we have severe, undeniable geopolitical strain. Persistent, escalating conflicts in the Middle East have heavily disrupted major shipping lanes, particularly through the Red Sea. Massive cargo vessels are being forced to take much longer, vastly more expensive routes all the way around the entire continent of Africa. This has caused energy prices and shipping insurance costs to spike all over again, creating this nagging, persistent energy shock that has actually halted the decline of global inflation. But on the exact opposite side of the rope, acting as a massive counterweight, we have the AI revolution. Tech giants are aggressively pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into massive data centers, hyper-advanced chips, and foundational infrastructure. So you have the messy, old-world chaos of energy politics desperately dragging the global economy down, violently fighting against the futuristic, massive economic thrust of the New World AI boom. And what is the result of that tug of war? Well, despite the incredible, undeniable surge of the tech boom, the global machine as a whole remains notably sluggish. Major economic institutions have actually had to step in and aggressively downgrade their global growth outlooks, pushing them far below what we considered normal before the pandemic. Look at these numbers. The UN forecasts a really sluggish 2.5% global GDP growth for 2026. The IMF projected a slightly more optimistic, but still incredibly subdued 3.1%. The message from the data is undeniably clear here. While the tech sector is surging into the future, energy importing nations are being squeezed tightly by high operational costs and punishingly high borrowing rates. The global economy is sitting in a weak spot, and honestly, the overall risks are pointing firmly downwards.
Let's move to our final section, Phase 5, Lessons from the Economic Chaos. Let's distill what these 6 wild years actually taught us about survival.
The biggest takeaway? The stable, highly predictable pre-2020 world is gone forever. It's just not coming back. To survive whatever comes next, we have to adopt some completely new mental models. First, resilience is now far, far more important than raw efficiency. That hyper-efficient, just-in-time model we started with, it's simply too fragile for an era defined by pandemics and geopolitical wars. We need buffers now. Second, massive policy interventions always come with incredibly hard trade-offs. The trillion-dollar stimulus that successfully saved her from a depression in 2020 was the exact same medicine that directly fueled the crippling inflation of 2021 and 2022. There is no free lunch. Third, the global economy is permanently fragmented. The era of everyone holding hands and rising together is over. Where you are physically located in the world dictates your economic reality more than ever before. And finally, perhaps most importantly, the economy isn't just a bunch of sterile lines on a chart. It's a human system. It is entirely driven by our fear, our confidence, and our adaptation. It's driven by the business owners who panicked and hoarded their staff, and the millions of consumers who radically, suddenly, shifted from buying physical goods to chasing life experiences.
This incredible journey from 2020 to 2026 has completely, fundamentally reshaped our understanding of risk and global trade. The world absolutely didn't collapse, but it has been permanently altered, which leaves us with a really provocative thought as we wrap up this explainer today. Have we actually learned the right lessons from all this chaos? As we move forward into a highly complex, fragmented landscape that is constantly torn between old world energy politics and new world AI revolutions, are our governments, our businesses, and honestly, are you yourself ready to navigate a transformed world where the only real certainty left is chaos? That is the ultimate question that will define the next decade of our lives. Thanks for joining me.